Cascadia County, Washington, July 23, 2026. A little after 8:20 in the morning. On the flank of a mountain most people assume is asleep, a needle jumps. It belongs to a seismograph. It has been drawing a nearly flat line for hours. Now it scribbles. A tiny earthquake, roughly magnitude 0.9, at a depth most of us will never see. About an hour later, another one, roughly magnitude 0.8. Neither would rattle a coffee cup on your kitchen counter. Two small tremors. On any other mountain, forgotten by lunchtime. But this is not any other mountain. This is Mount St. Helens. And here is what almost no news report told you that day. While the ground under the mountain was shaking, the mountain itself was not doing what every schoolbook diagram of a volcano says it should. It was not swelling. It was not bulging. If anything, its surface had been quietly settling for years. Sinking, deflating, going down. So which is it? Is Mount St. Helens quietly reloading, or is it quietly dying? Everything you were taught about volcanoes says a mountain about to erupt should rise. This one is doing the opposite, is shrinking and trembling at the same time. And it is sitting on the calmest alert level. The United States Geological Survey has normal aviation color code green, while something in the dark down there is unmistakably moving. According to public bulletins from the Cascades Volcano Observatory, the agency built out of the ashes of the last time this mountain let go, nobody is calling for an evacuation. Nobody is drawing hazard zones. Nobody is planting reflectors on the flank to measure a bulge growing 5 feet a day, the way they had to in the spring of 1980. And yet, something is happening. Something small enough to miss on the evening news, and important enough that the scientists whose entire job is to watch this peak lean a little closer every time it does. This is the strangest part. On paper, that morning was almost nothing. In context, it was a question. The question is not whether Mount St. Helens will erupt someday. It will. It is the most active volcano in the Cascade Range. On a long enough timeline, the answer is always yes. The real question is what those tiny earthquakes actually mean. Whether the mountain we are looking at in the summer of 2026 is filling or firing. Whether we are watching a countdown that nobody has recognized yet, or something completely different, something almost nobody outside volcanology even has a name for. Because the version of Mount St. Helens that should genuinely frighten you looks nothing like the morning of July 23rd. And the version that actually fits what we are seeing has a much stranger story to tell. This is the story of a mountain that shakes without swelling, of a plate that never stops sinking, 30 miles off the coast of Washington, of a countdown that ran in plain view for 2 full months in the spring of 1980 and cost 57 lives, of 2 false alarms in the last 2 years that fooled thousands and meant nothing, of a swarm in 2016 that looked identical to what is happening now and resolved into silence, and of 5 specific signals that, when they finally arrive together, will tell us the calm is over. By the end, that boring green status will feel like the most reassuring sentence in the world, and also the most fragile. Because to understand what is really going on beneath Mount St. Helens, you cannot stay up here on the surface, where the coffee sits perfectly still. You have to follow the tremors down, past the old lava, past the crater floor, into a system that begins its work 16 miles below the mountain, in the dark, where the real story of this volcano has always been written. Let us go down. There is a word for what Mount St. Helens is doing this summer. Scientists use it constantly in their bulletins. It sounds bureaucratic and gentle, right up until you understand what it hides underneath. The word is recharge. Before I unpack it, let me hand you a yardstick you can carry through the rest of the story. Because your instincts about volcanoes are almost certainly wrong in a specific and useful way. And every diagram you have ever seen, the perfect cone, the red arrow rising straight up, has installed the wrong picture. Rising magma does 2 things, and they are the fingerprint of a real ascent. It inflates, and it shallows. Inflates means the surface swells. Not subtly. When molten rock forces its way toward the crater, the ground overhead has to stretch and lift to accommodate it. It is not optional. You cannot push a body of magma into the shallow part of a mountain without the surface reacting. Shallows means the earthquakes climb. They do not sit still. They march upward, week by week, from deeper levels toward the surface, like footsteps up a staircase toward a door. Inflates. And shallows. Hold on to those 2 words. Now hold them up against the summer of 2026. The earthquakes are there. Small, occasional, real. The instruments recorded them. But look for inflation, and it is not there. Look for shallowing, and it is not there either. The surface of the mountain is settling, not rising. The quakes are sitting far below the crater, not climbing toward it. 2 of the 3 fingerprints of a real ascent are simply missing. What you have instead is shaking without swelling, energy without lift. And that is not a subtle distinction tucked away in a footnote. It is the whole puzzle, because rising magma leaves a signature. And the signature that is present under Mount St. Helens is a different one. That signature has been written into this mountain many times over the last 2 decades. Since the dome-building episode that ran from 2004 to 2008 wound down, the volcano has muttered like this on a schedule. Small clusters of little quakes, far below. Nothing on the surface. The instruments picking up something, then quiet. Then something again. If you assume Mount St. Helens is a sleeping giant that suddenly stirred on July 23rd, you have already misread the mountain. The truth is closer to this. It has been stirring quietly for years. What is rare is not that it moves. What is rare is that we notice. And here is why the word matters, and why the shaking without swelling signature points where it does. Filling the tank and firing the tank are 2 entirely different events, sometimes separated by decades. A recharging volcano is a volcano being resupplied from below. Fresh magma arriving. Pressure building in a chamber a few miles down. The rock around that chamber straining to hold it in. That straining produces small, deep earthquakes, the pops of a system flexing under new load. But the pressure stays in the tank. The magma does not climb. The surface above miles of solid rock barely notices. An erupting volcano is what happens when the tank stops merely filling and starts emptying itself upward through the crust. Different physics, different signal, different depth, same mountain, different behavior. And you can tell them apart if you know what to look for. This is where the boring official calm comes from. Is not that the scientists are ignoring the tremors. Is that they can read them. And what those tremors say in the language of a system watched by more instruments than almost any other volcano on Earth is quiet, patient recharge. There is a shallow reservoir sitting a couple of miles below the crater floor. Above it, the young dome the mountain built between 2004 and 2008. Below it, a much older, much larger machine reaching down into the base of the crust. All of it is alive. None of it, right now, is climbing toward the door. The yardstick inflates shallows is what separates the alive part from the erupting part. And to see why sinking on the outside can happen while filling on the inside, we need to open the mountain up and look at how its plumbing is actually built. Because the picture in your head is almost certainly wrong. And the real picture is a lot stranger. Forget the cartoon volcano. The one with the round chamber full of glowing orange liquid, a straight red arrow, and a smooth cone on top. That picture, the one from your school textbook, is doing more harm than good. The real plumbing beneath Mount St. Helens looks nothing like a soda bottle. It is a tall, thin system, stacked in layers, reaching from the deep crust all the way up to the crater floor. Each layer does its own job on its own clock. Start at the bottom. Roughly 16 miles below the summit, near the base of the crust, magma is born. Is not stored down there. Is generated. Heat and pressure squeeze molten rock out of the lower crust, and buoyancy sends a melt upward. Because molten rock is lighter than solid rock, it rises. Slowly, threading through fractures and grain boundaries the way something lighter always works its way up through something heavier. And when I say slowly, I mean it in a way news cycles cannot handle. This is not a process measured in hours. It plays out over years, sometimes decades. The volcano keeps its own clock, and its clock runs slow. Somewhere between 2.5 and 6 miles below sea level, the rising melt pools. This is the shallow reservoir, the tank. This is where recharge happens. It is where fresh magma from below meets whatever is already stored and adds itself to the total. Now, correct the second cartoon in your head. The reservoir is not a cavern brimming with orange liquid. It is closer to a hot, stiff sponge. Mostly solid rock, threaded through with molten rock, a mush. A rock-hard body soaked with melt. That distinction sounds like a technicality. It is not. It changes everything about how a filling reservoir behaves. A pool of liquid transmits pressure to its walls instantly. Push more in from below, and the whole thing shoves outward at once. If Mount St. Helens sat over that, every recharge event would translate into visible bulging on the surface. It does not. A mush absorbs. It buffers. New magma pushes in, new pressure builds, and the surrounding partly molten rock soaks up much of that change without immediately shoving the crater floor upward. The signal muffles. The strain distributes, which is exactly why you can have a system taking on fresh magma for months and instruments overhead reading nothing dramatic on the surface. Not because nothing is happening, because the mush is doing its job. But something has to give, and that is where the earthquakes come from. When fresh magma arrives, it raises the pressure inside the reservoir. That pressure squeezes fluids, hot water, and dissolved gas out into the maze of cracks and fractures lacing the crust around the tank. Those fluids force their way through. And as they do, they change the friction on tiny faults that were sitting locked and quiet. A fault stuck for a century slips a few millimeters. That slip is a tiny earthquake. Then another crack. Then another slip. Scattered around the filling tank, at reservoir depth, small and diffuse. Look at that description again. And then look at the morning of July 23rd. Small. Deep. Clustered around the reservoir. Not climbing. It fits. There is one more piece of the plumbing worth naming, because it becomes important later. Magma is not only molten rock. It carries dissolved gases inside it. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, water, held under pressure the way carbonation is held inside a sealed can. When a system is merely recharging far below, most of that gas stays locked in the reservoir. The miles of rock overhead keep it pinned. Aircraft periodically fly over the crater, sampling the air. If magma were genuinely climbing toward the surface, the pressure holding those gases dissolved would drop, and gas would start venting. The instruments would catch it. Right now, the mountain is holding its breath. And so the sinking surface stops being a paradox. If magma were climbing, the surface would swell. It is not. The activity is staying in the tank, at reservoir depth, exactly where recharge lives. Shaking without swelling is not a contradiction. It is a confirmation. It is what the tank filling in the dark actually looks like from above, which raises the obvious question. If today looks like this, what does a real countdown look like? We do not have to guess. This mountain has done it once, in front of the entire March 1980. The mountain had been asleep for 123 years. Not restless. Not muttering. Asleep. The last serious activity in local memory ran back to the 1850s. Generations were born and died in the Pacific Northwest with the volcano as a postcard, a symmetrical cone rising above the fir trees, the kind of peak people called perfect because of how cleanly it climbed against the sky. If you had told anyone living in its shadow that this thing was a loaded weapon, most of them would have laughed. It looked asleep. It had looked asleep their entire lives. And that long, convincing sleep is exactly what makes the spring of 1980 the most valuable teaching tape in American volcanology. Because in the middle of March that year, the mountain woke up. And it did not do it quietly. And it did not do it in the pattern we are watching this summer. It did the opposite pattern, every step of the way. Watch how it began. A swarm of earthquakes started under the volcano. Within a week, they were coming by the hundreds. Not the far below, cannot feel it kind. These were bigger. Many of them large enough to feel. And crucially, they were shallow. Not just shallow. They were getting shallower, climbing upward, day after day, toward the summit. The yardstick from earlier inflates shallows. This was the shallowing half, unfolding in real time. The staircase was being climbed, step by step, toward the door. Then, on March 27, 1980, the mountain took a step today's mountain has not taken at all. A blast of steam tore a crater straight through the ice and snow at the summit. It was a phreatic explosion, one driven by groundwater flashing to steam against hot rock, not by fresh magma reaching the surface. But it announced something unmistakable. Heat had reached shallow levels. It was close enough to the surface to boil the water hiding there. Compare that to July 2026. There has been no phreatic blast, no crater torn in the ice, no column of steam and ash. The heat is not reaching up to boil the shallow water because the action, as we now know, is sitting far below in the reservoir. One of 1980's opening moves is simply absent from today's board. There was another signal in 1980 worth naming because it is one of the eerier sounds a volcano makes. Alongside the discrete pops of individual earthquakes, the instruments started picking up something continuous. Rhythmic. A hum. Scientists call it harmonic tremor. Ordinary earthquakes are sharp and separate, a jolt and then quiet, like someone knocking on a door. Harmonic tremor is different. It can go on for minutes or hours. It is generally read as the sound of fluid, magma or gas, moving through the system, vibrating rock as it flows. When the discrete knocks become a sustained hum, the character of the unrest has changed. The system has stopped merely flexing. Something is on the move. 1980 had that hum. The morning of July 23, 2026, did not. Just scattered pops, at reservoir depth, sharp and brittle. And then came the thing you did not need an instrument to see. By April, the north face of Mount St. Helens was pushing outward. Not swelling toward the sky at the summit, where you might expect a volcano to strain. Bulging sideways, low on the flank to the north. The number is the kind of number you read twice. Scientists clocked it at roughly 5 feet a day. 5 feet every day. A section of a mountain moving outward the length of a tall man's height in the span of a single day. And then doing it again the next day. And the next. Over the weeks it went on, that flank pushed out on the order of 450 feet from where it had been. A football field and a half of solid rock, standing where nothing had been before, growing in front of the entire country. What was actually under it was a body of shallow magma, lodged inside the flank, that geologists call a cryptodome, a hidden dome. The skin of the mountain was being stretched over a blister that would not stop filling. Inflates. And shallows. Both signals present. Both screaming. And loaded like a drawn bow, pointed sideways at anyone standing to the north. Today, that same flank is measured to the millimeter. It is not swelling. It is settling. Every needle that pinned red in 1980 is sitting green in 2026. The count to 8:32 in the morning, May 18, 1980. That is the time stamp on the moment everything the mountain had been building toward for 2 months came due, in a matter of seconds. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath Mount St. Helens. On its own, a 5.1 is a moderate quake. The kind that rattles dishes and cracks plaster. But this one hit a mountain whose entire north face was already stretched to its limit over a body of shallow magma. And it knocked out the last support holding that face in place. What happened next was the largest landslide in recorded human history. The whole bulging north flank of Mount St. Helens came loose at once and slid away. Billions of tons of rock. An entire side of a mountain in motion roaring downhill at well over 100 miles an hour. Filling valleys. Burying a river, swallowing everything in its path. And in sliding away, that flank did something with consequences worse than the landslide itself. It uncorked the mountain. Remember the cryptodome, the shallow body of magma that had been inflating the flank. It had been pressurized, held down, capped by the weight of the mountainside on top of it. When that mountainside suddenly slid off, the pressure released instantly, the way it does when you shear the cap off a shaken bottle rather than unscrewing it slowly. Except the release did not go straight up. With the north flank gone, the pressure blew sideways, out of the fresh wound in the mountain's side. This is what is meant by the lateral blast. And it is the detail that made 1980 so lethal. The explosion traveled outward low and fast across the ground, not politely upward into the sky. The numbers are hard to hold in your head. It flattened forests across roughly 230 square miles. Full-grown trees, snapped and laid down in neat rows, pointing away from the mountain like matchsticks combed by a giant hand. The mountain itself lost around 1,300 feet of its height. Its summit dropped from roughly 9,677 feet to about 8,363. The symmetrical cone that had been a postcard for generations was gone, replaced by a gaping horseshoe crater open to the north. Ash climbed into the sky and drifted east, reaching Idaho by around noon. In the language scientists used to rank these things, it was a volcanic explosivity index of 5. A genuinely major eruption. And then there is the number that is not really a number at all. 57 people died that morning. Among them was a young United States Geological Survey scientist named David A. Johnston. He was stationed at an observation post called Coldwater, about 6 miles from the summit. A distance everyone had believed was safe. It was not. When the blast came, Johnston got the warning out in a radio call that has echoed through volcanology ever since. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. Those were among his last words. He was killed moments later. His body was never found. The observatory that now watches these Cascade volcanoes is named after him, the David A. Johnston Cascades Volcano Observatory. The people staring at the seismographs under Mount St. Helens this summer work in a building named for a man the mountain killed for standing 6 miles away. That is not a footnote. It is the reason today's calm has authority. Almost everything the world now knows about reading a volcano in real time was learned or sharpened in the aftermath of that single morning. the lateral blast, the flank collapse, the specific warning signs that precede them. All of it was written in blood and ash in 1980 and built directly into the monitoring system that watches Mount St. Helens now. If you find any of this useful, take a second and hit the like button before we go further. Is a small thing on your end. It genuinely helps this channel keep making investigations like this one. Now back to the mountain, because the horror of that morning is what gives today's reassurance its weight. The scientists calling this summer swarm ordinary are not casual about that call. They are the professional descendants of the people who died learning to make it. And when you lay everything we now know about 1980 next to everything we know about 2026, the two mountains stop looking anything like the same thing, which means the pressure driving today's tremors has to be coming from somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else does not sit under the mountain. It sits offshore under the cold water of the Pacific, where a plate has been sinking for millions of years, and a very slow machine has been building this mountain since before anyone was alive to name it. Step back from the mountain for a second and ask the question almost nobody thinks to ask. Why is there a volcano here at all? Mountains do not simply decide to fill with magma. Something has to make the molten rock, and keep making it, and keep pushing it up toward the surface, year after year, for the recharge we have been describing to even be possible. The something that does that for Mount St. Helens is not under the mountain. It is under the ocean. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, a slab of the seafloor called the Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced underneath the western edge of North America. The ocean plate is denser. Where the two meet, the ocean plate loses. It bends downward and dives beneath the continent, sliding slowly into the hot interior of the Earth at an angle. Mile after mile, over millions of years. This is subduction. And it is the same machinery that stores the region's largest earthquake hazard, the one people worry about along the entire coast from Northern California up to British Columbia. But subduction does something else besides load up earthquakes. Something that turns a plate boundary into a chain of volcanoes. Here is the mechanism. The ocean plate that is diving down carries water with it. Water locked into the seafloor rocks and sediments. As that slab sinks and heats up, the water is cooked out of it, driven upward into the wedge of hot mantle rock sitting above the descending plate. You might think adding water to already scorching rock would do nothing. Water does something counterintuitive. It lowers the temperature at which rock melts. The mantle up there is hot enough to be on the edge of melting, but not quite there. The arrival of water from a sinking slab tips it over the edge. The rock begins to melt. Magma is born, not from extra heat, from the water wrung out of a drowning plate. That newborn magma is lighter than the solid rock around it, so it begins to rise. And where it collects and works its way toward the surface, you get a volcano. Line up all the places along the Pacific Northwest where this is happening, and you get the Cascade Arc. The great row of volcanoes standing back from the coast, parallel to that hidden boundary offshore. Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, Mount Hood, further south Mount Shasta. They are not a random scatter of peaks. They are the surface expression of a single process, the smokestacks of one enormous, slow machine. And among all of them, Mount St. Helens is the star pupil, the youngest, the most active, the one that erupts most often and most recently. The magma it tends to produce is stickier and more charged with gas than the runnier lavas of some of its neighbors. Stickier, gassier magma is the kind that, when it finally erupts, tends to do so explosively rather than gently, which is precisely what the world saw in 1980. So Mount St. Helens sits in a peculiar position. It is the most likely of the Cascade volcanoes to do something in a given lifetime, and also the most likely to do that something violently. That combination is why a couple of small tremors under this particular mountain draw attention. Identical tremors under a quieter peak never would. If any of that is landing for you, subscribe. This channel keeps mapping the systems most people never see running underneath everyday news, and the Cascadia machine is one of the biggest of them. Now the connection back to today. When we talk about magma recharging the reservoir beneath Mount St. Helens, this is where that magma ultimately comes from. The water squeezed out of the Juan de Fuca Plate. The melting it triggers far below. The slow rise of that melt into the plumbing under the mountain. The recharge is not a fluke or a random stirring. It is the near-surface end of a conveyor belt that runs from the ocean floor down into the mantle, and every earthquake comes with a location. That location has 3 parts. 2 of them are the ones people quote, the latitude and longitude spot on the map. The third one is left out of the headlines almost every time. And it is the one that actually matters when you are reading A Restless Mountain. Depth. Because a quake 2 miles down and a quake half a mile down can look identical in magnitude and mean completely opposite things. Think of the system under Mount St. Helens as a building with floors. Each floor produces a different kind of earthquake with a different meaning. Far down, around the reservoir a couple miles below sea level, quakes are small, clustered, and tied to pressure. The little pops of a filling tank straining the rock around it. That is the recharge floor. Higher up, in the shallow body of the mountain near the crater, earthquakes mean something more urgent. That is where magma would be if it were actually climbing toward an eruption. Shallow quakes that grow in number and creep upward are the signature of ascent. The difference between a swarm on the lower floor and a swarm on the upper floor is quite literally the difference between a mountain that is filling and a mountain that is firing. So where were the earthquakes on July 23rd? Down at the lower levels, clustered around the reservoir, not up near the crater floor. Recharge floor, not ascent floor. This is the quiet technical core of why the mountain is on green. Is not that anyone is ignoring the swarm, is that they can read its depth. And depth places it exactly where filling happens and nowhere near where erupting begins. The location on the map made news because the map says Mount St. Helens. The location in depth is what the professionals actually read. And in depth, it says calmly recharge. Compare that to 1981 more time. The magnitude 5.1 that triggered the collapse struck up in mountain, right at the level of the bulge where the shallow magma had intruded. Upper floor. Today's tremors are basement events. Same mountain, different floor. The floor is the whole story. And here is the fact that should quietly dissolve most of the remaining worry. Because it is not a theory or an analogy. It is a rerun. Mount St. Helens did this exact thing 10 years ago. Beginning around the middle of March 2016, seismographs under the mountains started picking up small earthquakes at a rising rate. Over roughly 8 weeks, the regional network formally located more than 130 of them. And in a phrase that will matter enormously in a moment, the scientists themselves noted that there were many more too small to be located at all. The located count was 130 and change. The true count was higher. And the people running the network said so out loud in public statements. Sit with that. We will need it when we deal with the accusation that the agencies hide the numbers. Look at the character of that 2016 swarm. Most of the earthquakes came in at magnitude 0.5 or smaller. Far below anything a person could feel. The largest of the entire 8-week sequence reached only about magnitude 1.3, and they were happening between roughly 1 and 4 miles below the surface. Down at the reservoir, on the recharge floor, small, low, clustered around the tank. The exact fingerprint. The rate is worth pausing on because it sounds alarming on its face. As the weeks went on, the swarm did not fade. It grew. By the later stretch, the mountain was producing on the order of 40 located earthquakes a week. 40 a week. And climbing. If you knew nothing else, that acceleration would sound like a countdown. Here is where the other instruments earned their keep. The scientists were not only counting quakes. They were watching everything else, and everything else was quiet. No anomalous gas over the crater. No inflation of the surface. No migration of the quakes upward toward the crater. Just a rising count of small, low pops. Their public conclusion was recharge. And they said something else, worth quoting in spirit. Recharge can continue for many years beneath a volcano without leading to an eruption. Not hours, not weeks, years. They had the receipts. From this very mountain. Between roughly 1987 and 2004, 17 years, Mount St. Helens quietly recharged without erupting. Which brings us to the one detail that does not copy over cleanly from 2016. And it is the one we started with. In 2016, the ground was roughly holding its shape. In 2026, it is sinking. And if we are being honest, we cannot simply wave that away. So here is the answer. And it forces us to stop thinking of Mount St. Helens as one thing. Is not one thing. It is two stacked. Below, miles down, the reservoir is refilling. Since the last eruption wound down in 2008, fresh magma has been arriving from the deep and rebuilding pressure in the tank. That is the process producing today's small earthquakes. Above, at the top of the mountain, is a young lava dome, a pile of freshly erupted rock the volcano built between 2004 and 2008. That rock is still cooling, still crystallizing, still releasing trapped gas, still compacting under its own weight. And every one of those shallow processes does the same thing to the surface above it. It contracts. It settles. It sinks. The deflation is not the tank draining. Is the lid cooling? Two floors. Two independent processes. Pointing in opposite directions. Both completely normal. Which finally lets us handle the accusation. The one that appears every time somebody notices the raw seismic trace has more little wiggles than the official catalog. The claim goes, for every quake the authorities announce, dozens more are happening that they will not report. The calm is a cover-up. The true part first, without flinching. There really are more events on the raw traces than appear in the located catalog. That gap is real. Where the conspiracy version falls apart is what the gap means. To formally locate a quake, you need the same signal recorded clearly at several stations so you can triangulate. The smallest events show up on only one instrument or two, and there is not enough information solved for where they were. They are not being suppressed. They are physically unlocatable. A whisper heard by one microphone cannot be placed in a room. That is geometry, not secrecy. And the seismic traces themselves are public. The independent watchers who count extra events on the raw records are reading the same live feeds the observatory publishes to the world. You cannot hide a signal you are streaming in real time. The real danger with this mountain is not hidden data, is misreading signals in plain sight. Mount St. Helens fooled thousands of people twice in the last 2 years in full public view. In 2023 and 2024, the earthquake rate spiked to the highest level since 2008. Every reassurance test passed, and the swarm faded. Then on September 16, 2025, gray plumes rose above the summit. The obvious interpretation was terrifying. The USGS had to publicly clarify that the mountain was not erupting. The plumes were 45-year-old ash from 1980, still sitting on the flanks, lifted by strong wind. A ghost of the last eruption, wearing the costume of a new one. Which is why we should end with the only thing worth memorizing. What a real countdown will look like next time. 5 signals, each one the mirror image of something we are seeing today. 1. The earthquakes start climbing, migrating upward from the reservoir toward the shallow mountain. Basement events becoming top floor events. 2. The discrete pops become a hum. Sustained harmonic tremor takes over from sharp, separate jolts, the signature of fluid on the move. 3. The surface stops sinking and starts rising. Deflation reverses to inflation. Instruments measuring the shape of the mountain to the millimeter catch an inhale replacing an exhale. 4. The mountain begins to breathe. Carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide climbing in the readings over the crater. The magma exhaling as pressure drops. 5. A phreatic blast. Steam punching a fresh crater in the summit ice, exactly as it did in March of 1980. None of them are present in the summer of 2026. Not one. So when someone says the mountain is moving again and expect your stomach to drop, you now have something better than fear to answer with. Yes, it is moving. The tank is filling. The lid is cooling. The plate is sinking.